Okay, good afternoon to all. Welcome to the third session of the IISD University of Geneva webinar series on trade and sustainable development. My name is Makan Moin Beng. I'm a professor of international law and director of the Department of International Law and International Organization of the University of Geneva. It is a pleasure to welcome you all. The main objective of this webinar series on trade and sustainable development is to inform the trade community on how to shape the trade regime to make societies more resilient, able to cope with future shocks, be it pandemics, climate change, or other systemic threats. We are happy today to organize the third session of our webinar series after our last two successful events. The first one dealt with the issue of trade and health, in particular in light of the outcomes of the last World Health Assembly. Our second session dealt with the issue of multilateral environmental agreements and the trade regime, and in particular how we could explore options under CITES to prevent future pandemics. And today our session is going to focus on voluntary sustainability standards, public procurement, and trade policy. And we will look in particular at the trends, challenges, and development implications, in particular for developing countries and least developed countries. And to address this very important issue of voluntary sustainability standards and public procurement, we have with us a great panel of experts that will be moderated by Madame Cristina Larrea. Cristina leads the Sustainability Standards Work Stream at IISD. She has over 15 years of experience working in the fields of economic and financial inclusion and sustainable development, in particular working directly with women, youth, indigenous population, and agriculture and forestry, small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries. So we could not dream better than her to moderate such a panel on voluntary sustainability standards. So without further ado, Christina, you have the floor to kick off the discussions. Thank you very much.
Merci, Professor Makane. Thank you so much. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone who is joining in our session today. So it is my pleasure to moderate the discussion with four senior experts, as Professor Makane mentioned, on this exciting topic that we are covering today. As you might know from our promotion efforts, this webinar builds upon a recently launched report from a close partner, the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, entitled Scaling Up Voluntary Sustainability Standards Through Sustainable Public Procurement and Trade Policy. And we are honored today to have with us the two authors of this report, Santiago and Axel. So I would like to welcome to this webinar Santiago Fernandez de Córdoba. He is based in Geneva. He is a senior economist at UNTAD and coordinator of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. He advised governments on economic and sustainable development. He has been a trade policy expert for over 20 years, particularly on trade negotiations, market access issues, sustainable standards, and structural adjustment. He is the editor of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards flagship series. Welcome, Santiago. Thank you for being with us today. Now I would like to welcome Axel Marx, who is author of this report. He is Deputy Director at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at the University of Leuven. His research interests include voluntary sustainability standards, sustainable development, human rights, global governance, and European Union trade policy. He has been working on VSSs for more than 15 years now and has published on the emergence, development, design, and effectiveness of these standards. Welcome, Axel, to this webinar today. So Santiago and Axel are accompanied in this panel by two of my colleagues at IISD, who have a long track record working on issues concerning sustainable public procurement and trade policy, Natalie and Lisbeth. They will comment on the findings that Santiago and Axel will present, building from IISD work in this area. So I would like to welcome Natalie Bernasconi-Osterwalder. She is the head of the Economic Law and Policy Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and she is also the Executive Director of IISD in Europe. Natalie is a senior international lawyer and has extensive legal, policy, and training experience in the areas of international trade, investment, sustainable development, human rights, international environmental law, and arbitration. Good afternoon, Natalie, and thank you for being with us today. And my colleague, Elizabeth Cassier, also based in Geneva. She is a policy advisor with IISD Economic Law and Policy Program. She works with the public procurement and infrastructure finance team on research and advisory services that involve innovation in public procurement. She also works at IISD Sustainable Asset Valuation, which is an assessment methodology that helps governments and investors direct capital towards sustainable infrastructure. So welcome, the four of you, to this interesting panel discussion, and looking forward to hear from your experience and background on this interesting topic that we are addressing today. So let's look at the agenda. So first of all, we're going to have some introductory remarks that I will provide. After, we're going to head the floor to Santiago and Axel. They're going to present the main findings of the report. This section will be followed with comments from Natalie and Lisbeth from their own perspective in sustainable public procurement and trade policy. And this will lead us to open a question and answer session with you all. Finally, we will end up the webinar with some concluding remarks highlighting key takeaways and from the session. Before we start, providing some introductory remarks, we would like to know what is the audience. We have around 130 people registered to this event. So we would like to know what is the starting level of VSSs, or voluntary sustainability standards, in the room. Sophia, can you help us with the first poll? Okay. Do you see? Okay, let's leave some few seconds. Sophia, you get some answers?
Yes, we have nearly 80% of our audience already responding, just a few more still to go.
Very good.
Okay, I think we can go ahead and stop the poll, and I will share the results on the screen.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so how well, we asked the audience, how well do you know voluntary sustainability standards? So the majority, there is like a split audience profile. I have some solid background, 39%. I have some basic knowledge, 37%. Okay. I am an expert, 20%, very good. And I don't know about them, 5%. Okay, so we have like participants that have a certain level of voluntary sustainability standards. Very good. So let's continue to the next session, to this piece. So for those that have less knowledge on voluntary sustainability standards, I would like to provide some remarks. Sophia, can you just go to the next step? So as you might know, VSSs are initiatives largely established by non-state actors that establish requirements for producers and that producers and producers need to comply with to advance good social and environmental practices. They are voluntary as opposed to mandatory, but they can act as de facto requirement to enter a market. And this might pose a problem, as we will see later on, to smaller scale farmers that are less ready to become certified. So at IISD, we have been working on the area of sustainability standards for around 12, 15 years now. And we have two main areas of work. Research and advisory services. Our research activities include studying production and consumption trends of standard compliant commodities versus conventional, and benchmarking standards criteria to better understand the strengths or limits to deliver sustainable development outcomes. Our advisory services are mainly aimed at government officials and ministries to support making informed decisions related to standards to advance sustainability. So as you might know, over the past year, IISD, next slide, please. IISD has launched 8 commodity reports that illustrate production and consumption trends of a selection of commodities compliant with voluntary sustainability standards at global level. Overall, in this report, we have found that the growth of standard compliant production outpaced conventional for all the commodities that we have examined in the period 2008, 2016, and 2018, reaching in some example 20 to 30% of total volume of production in 2028 for some commodities, like for instance, cocoa and cotton. However, we have also found that for some commodities, including coffee, tea, there is an estimated market imbalance, which means that demand is lower than supply, or in other words, there is an oversupply of a standard compliant production in the market. So in this context, next slide, please. Is there a role that state actors play, are influencing in this market uptake, or could play to expand market uptake of commodities compliant to voluntary sustainability standards through public policy? Is there a role to play? If so, why? What is the value of that role? And how would that role look like? How state actors can leverage VSSs and expand market uptake? What would be the limits and risk of that of the governments taking that approach, especially for least developed countries that are less ready to use VSSs as a market access opportunity? So we are going to explore some of these questions with Santiago and Axel as a result of the report that they launched a couple of months ago. So please, Santiago and Axel, I leave you the floor and walk us through your findings.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for that really nice introduction and for setting the tone of the discussions of today. It's really refreshing to see the way you have framed the main problems that we want to discuss in our presentation. Let me just start by thanking both University of Geneva, Professor McCann, and IISD, you and Natalie, for the kind invitation to have to hold this webinar and to share a bit of our findings from the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards 4th flagship. At the outset, just a small reflection. I want to really pay a tribute to the collaboration that we've had between IISD and UNFSS and the United Nations family for almost over 20 years ago. If some of those that probably remember, you know, in 2003, both IISD and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development launched the Sustainable Commodities Initiative, which in essence is sort of what brings us together 17 years today, where we're working on these issues and seeing how we can maximize the value of voluntary sustainability standards to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this tribute, just to mention two key persons that were visionaries in this work and that are no longer with us. One is Jason Potts, which obviously from the side of IISD led this work for over so many years, and it's in a way from the side of IISD helped the United Nations do its work better in terms of supporting developing countries. And from our side, from the United Nations, we lost our dear colleague Boniface Angulo last year, who was leading this project, who was also fundamental in pushing us to do the kind of research that we do in terms of the flagship. Having said that, we're here to discuss about voluntary sustainability standards as a market-based tool to help us achieve sustainable development goals. And we think about voluntary sustainability standards in particular as a tool to transform the way we're producing, we're consuming, and we are trading. In the world that we see today, with the problematic that we're seeing today, we feel that the things are changing too quickly, and we think that the way we're trading, the way we're managing our value chains internationally, in particular with regards to some of those commodities that you've mentioned, it's fundamental that we keep in mind the sustainable angle, and we keep in mind trying to continue enhancing the social, the environmental, and economic welfare that we try to address through voluntary sustainability standards. And let's just move forward, because what we want to do today is we want to present the findings of the fourth United Nations Forum, Scaling Up Voluntary Sustainability Standards, because as we're looking at two policy tools, which are sustainable public procurement and trade policy. At the outset, for those that don't know what is United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, UNFSS is a joint initiative of 5 UN agencies: FAO, ITC, UN Environment, UNIDO, and UNCTAD, working on the VSS and its potential to achieve SDGs by facilitating developing countries' access to global markets, stimulating a well-informed dialogue among key stakeholders at the national and international level, and of course, by elevating the capacities of producers, small and medium enterprises and exporters, which sometimes can be marginalized by VSS in global trade, as we heard from Christina before. UNCTAD is the Secretariat of UNFSS. And just to let you know that in UNFSS, basically, we work on these 3 areas that I have mentioned, and these 3 products. One of them is obviously research and analysis, where we have our flagship reports that we publish every 2 years on key issues that we feel that are relevant for discussion for our beneficiaries in developing countries with regards to voluntary sustainability standards. Then we also support national platforms. We support national initiatives of multi-stakeholders approaches with regards to voluntary sustainability standards. We're working in over about 20 countries, and we have launched 4 key platforms around the world, which are supported by United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. These are the VSS platforms in China, in India, in Mexico, and Brazil. And last but not least, we also have this international dialogue where we try to bring together the different actors from the government, the standard systems, the civil society, and academia, so that they can discuss in detail the issues and the implications about voluntary sustainability standards. And that is our key in terms of the United Nations work that we're doing and how we're addressing the issue of voluntary sustainability standards. In terms of what we discuss or what we look at are the insights from the fourth flagship, we're looking at the issue, we start looking at the issue in the publication of voluntary sustainability standards in terms of what are the key elements for the adoption among countries in terms of voluntary sustainability standards. What are the main variables which determine that one country or another country or their producer sector decides to adopt voluntary sustainability standards. Then we also look at some of the drivers for voluntary sustainability standards uptake. And we look at this through 2 key policy tools, which are sustainable procurement and trade policy. And of course, we look at how these VSS can support sustainable development, and of course, public procurement goes together. What is the links between of them? And we sort of also look in terms of what is the key elements for developing countries with regards to these policy tools and with regards to voluntary sustainability standards. Now, we have 5 key policy proposals that come out from our research that we believe that are fundamental when we're looking at voluntary sustainability standards in the helm of public policy. One key policy proposal recommendation is that we feel that we need to enhance national capacity through a governance model that involves independent certification bodies to cope with the rising demand for VSS. We feel that there is a need to enhance the capacity in many developing countries with regards to how the certification is being done, and hence this is something that comes out from our research. We also feel that there's many various ways in the way that VSS is being dealt with the trade policy instruments that need to be looked at. And one of those is that as of today, there's no link between the trade classification systems and VSS. There's a lack of data. And this is fundamental when we're trying to understand voluntary sustainability standards. Third, we need to avoid the proliferation of VSS systems through mutual recognition systems or other type of mechanisms. Fourth, we need to curb over-certification with appropriate measures. We need to address this issue that sometimes producers need to certify themselves up to 8 times or even higher, more than one certification standard. And this is an issue when it comes to developing countries' producers. And fifth, it's important that we conduct a political dialogue on the benefits of scaling up VSS. And this political dialogue needs to be bringing all together or the relevant partners into the discussions. So from the government, from the private sector, from the developing countries, from the South, from the producers, from the consumers, from the civil society. Now, there's a certain rationale in our flagship, in our report. And the rationale behind our report is fundamentally that VSS can play an important role in progressing towards sustainable development. We believe that VSS can play an important role, and for this reason, it should be looked at. This VSS can serve as a complementary tool for public policies to achieve sustainable development goals. This, we believe that it's in essence what leads us to believe that governments can increase the uptake of VSS for increased sustainability through sustainable public procurement and through trade policy. And we assume in our analysis that VSS can contribute to sustainable development. This is something that we have been proven in the literature before this flagship, and that we take as an assumptions in our analysis moving forward. Now, I would like to share with you some of the trends that we look at and that we find in our analysis. First of all, we see, as many of you or those that have a bit of experience in voluntary sustainability standards, or at least those that are in a way integrated into their consumption patterns as we move along in our consumption patterns on the daily life, we've seen that the number of voluntary sustainability standards has increased quite considerably since the beginning of the 1990s. And in the recent years, it has, for various reasons, maybe the acceleration process has slowed down a bit. Still, as of today, we see in the ITC standards map, we see over 250 voluntary sustainability standards that are functioning in the world internationally. If we considered another database, which is called Eco-Label Index, this number increases to over 450 sustainability standards. There's a bit of a methodological difference between how one database and another database classifies voluntary sustainability standards. And when it comes to the sectors where voluntary sustainability standards in a way have been taken, we see that there is a bit of a tendency of them being mostly concentrated in agriculture and agriculture products. And of course, there's also in textiles and garments, consumer and processed food and livestock and fish. Those are the main sectors where we feel that voluntary sustainability that we see, that the evidence shows where voluntary sustainabilities have been uptaking and are being implemented in the markets. Next, another of the evidence that we find in our research is that we find that voluntary sustainability standards have been, in a way, being uptaken in certain markets more than others, in certain countries more than others. Our analysis shows that VSS have been more, they function at a higher level in countries like Brazil, United States, China, India, and the European Union. We see that the largest economies in the world have been the ones, being the ones where it's leading the process of uptake of voluntary sustainability. From our research, this is probably shows that there's a certain correlation between open economies with diversified economic sectors and exports, with a certain level of well-functioning governments and a certain level of development, which tends to lead to the adoption of voluntary sustainability standards. This can also be sort of something that needs to be taken into account as we look as voluntary sustainability gaps as an instrument to fill some of those institutional gaps that we find sometimes in the way that markets function around the world. And with this basic introduction about the main issues that we looked into at the beginning of the publication, I would like to now invite our co-author Axel, Professor Axel Marx from Leuven, University of Leuven, to show us a bit more in detail the various drivers that we looked at in the publication and how we integrate them into public policy. Axel, up to you. I hope you managed better than me with the technological side and you're able to show your screen in a larger manner.
Thank you, Santiago. It's a pleasure to meet you all. And maybe Santiago, now you close your screen and I will try to upload my screen. And you should be able to see it now. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yours functions much better than mine.
All right, thank you very much. So just follow up on what Santiago has been saying. This flagship report is very much about trying to achieve sustainable development and try to think around how that can be done in a framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we look specifically at voluntary sustainability standards. And the starting point is basically that if they want to make an impact, if they want to be effective, they need to create an impact on the ground. And there are studies on that, and we can discuss that at length. But also they need to be used. They need to be adopted. And that's the focus of this report. And if we think about adoption, and Santiago nicely introduced it, we can think about drivers for adoption. And in the report, we see or we scan the many drivers for VSS adoption. That can be business to business, that can be consumer demand. But there is also an important role for governments to play. And that's what we try to highlight in the report. And in order to make that more concrete, we think about the role governments can play on two dimensions. One is related to sustainable public procurement, and I will introduce it in a minute. And the other one is related to trade policy and how trade policy can work with VSS or integrate VSS. In that context, let me first start with focusing a bit on sustainable public procurement. Why do we look at sustainable public procurement, or why do we look at public procurement? First of all, on any market in the world, the biggest buyers of goods, which are certified, which carries the voluntary sustainability standards logos, are governments. And in the report, we provide some statistics on the percentage of GDP governments buy on any market. And in highly developed OECD countries, that goes up to around 13–15%. In non-OECD countries, the volume of what the government buys on a market is even much higher. That means that governments can make a very big difference in how they buy and what they buy. If they buy environmentally and socially, let's say, aligned products, they contribute to sustainable development. If they buy products which try to downgrade social and environmental dimensions, they don't contribute to it. That has been recognized for quite some time, and that's why the idea came about sustainable public procurement. Let's try to use the purchasing power of governments to pursue sustainable development. What we see and highlight in the report that many countries are trying to do that in many different ways. And we give some examples in the report of how, for instance, the European Union is trying to do it, but also China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and Brazil. Now, in this whole movement towards sustainable public procurement, voluntary sustainability standards play a specific role. And that's what we also detail in the report. And a specific role they play is actually they enable government buyers to recognize sustainable products. Of course, sustainable public procurement cannot put in their laws like you need to buy a fair trade product with a fair trade logo, or you need to buy a product with a Forest Stewardship Council logo. But what they do is put similar sustainability criteria in the requirements for sustainable public procurement. And if a government buyer then wants to buy a product, they can use the logo as a shorthand to recognize sustainable products. And this is actually quite often explicitated in buying guides, buying documents for government procurers. And that actually enables them very much to try to, let's say, use VSS in sustainable public procurement. And the more sustainability concerns are integrated in public procurement, of course, the higher the adoption will be. And we try to highlight and discuss that in the report. In the report, we also try to address some of the, let's say, the issues we need to take into account when pursuing such a policy. And one is what we call greenwashing, and that has all to do with the fact that we know that there are many voluntary sustainability standards. Santiago just gave the numbers on the basis of 2 databases. And we know that in this realm of voluntary sustainability standards, you have very credible ones, but you also have non-credible ones. And you need to find systems to distinguish the two if you want to integrate them in sustainable public procurement. Second, we discuss in the report that pursuing sustainability to public procurement and VSS can be done with regard to certain commodities, but we should also be aware that with regard to certain other commodities, there are no voluntary sustainability standards available, and that limits a bit the potential where VSS can be used in sustainable public procurement. And if you remember, Santiago showed the slide on the main sectors in which voluntary sustainability standards are active. Christina in her introduction also highlighted some commodities, and it's typically in those sectors and those commodities where voluntary sustainability standards can play an important role. Also in a few others, but of course they cannot cover the whole range of what's normally captured under sustainable public procurement. That's a bit on the limitations and possibilities of this. In the third chapter of the report, we focus on trade policy and how trade policy can be, let's say, engage or integrate voluntary sustainability standards, which would then provide incentives or boost their adoption. And in the report, we basically discuss 4 trade instruments and how they can be related to voluntary sustainability standards. Free trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, import restrictions, and export promotion. Very brief on each of these components. First, we look in the report whether voluntary sustainability standards are already integrated in free trade agreements, bilateral, multilateral free trade agreements. And we observe that an increasing number of free trade agreements try to integrate what we call non-trade objectives: environmental protection, labor rights, sustainable development. And in these non-trade objectives and the chapters and trade agreements which deal with these non-trade objectives, we see the emergence of the use of voluntary sustainability standards. And we looked at the trend database, and we actually identified 19 free trade agreements which refer to voluntary sustainability standards or similar types of or wording. And typically what they include is a commitment by the parties in a trade agreement to collaborate and promote the use of these systems. Second, we look at the debate of voluntary sustainability standards and their potential role in a generalized scheme or system of preferences, which is basically a unilateral trade instrument pursued by certain countries, which gave preferential market access to middle income and developing countries if they comply with certain conditions. And in these discussions on these GSP systems, some authors have, let's say, proposed that voluntary sustainability standards could be integrated in them, in the sense that if you have as a product a label or a certificate or a voluntary standard, you might even get additional tariff preferences and so on. And we try to sketch that debate in the report. This is very, let's say, difficult debate in the sense that there are actually quite a few arguments pro and against such an approach, which we try to detail in the report. Third, we look at what we call import restriction or market regulation and the use of voluntary sustainability standards. And there we start from the observation that in certain countries, with regard to certain types of regulations, products are only allowed into a market if they comply with sustainability criteria, and sometimes very explicitly if they require or comply with the adoption of certification systems or voluntary sustainability standards. And in the report, we give some examples like the EU Timber Regulation, the South Korea Act on Sustainable Use of Timbers, the EU Renewable Energy Directive, and so on, just to pinpoint how these voluntary sustainability standards work as some kind of a mechanism with regard to market access. And we focus specifically on their role in what's been called more broadly due diligence requirements, which are included in this legislation and for which voluntary sustainability can be seen as a proof of compliance and hence facilitate access to the markets. Finally, we focus on VSS and export promotion. And we try to highlight the different ways in which voluntary sustainability standards are used in export promotion policies of certain countries. And that can be in terms of a conditionality. You can only get a license to export if you're certified. And we give an example of Gabon. There can be initiatives where a government provides financial incentives for certification, which then allows you access to other markets, and we provide the example of Vietnam. And there are certain policies which are pursued, which basically revolves around capacity building and trying to make sure that important export markets and export products are certified, which enable their spread. In all these policies, free trade agreements, GSP, import restriction, export promotion, the integration of voluntary sustainability standards in each of these instruments provides, of course, an important element or important driver for further adoption. And that's what we try to discuss in the report. At the end of the report, we take into account some further considerations which have to be taken into account. Starting very, let's say, basically from the idea where we started off from in the report, and is why would public policy be interested in integrating voluntary sustainability standards in the first place? And the argument we make in the report is that actually, if we look at, let's say, the international law bedrock of sustainable public procurement, let's say the international commitments you want to achieve with those. If you look at some of the international commitments you try to achieve in trade policy, if we refer to non-trade objectives, then we see that these commitments and these objectives are quite similar to some of the objectives voluntary sustainability standards try to achieve. So they actually start from a similar type of normative framework in terms of how sustainable development is approached and what they try to achieve. Now, what voluntary sustainability standards bring to public policy is that they offer, let's say, a whole set of rules and procedures to really try to achieve those commitments and objectives through compliance and through systems of compliance. And that means third-party auditing, setting up of complaint systems. They, in a nutshell, build a whole enforcement infrastructure which would enable not only to have certain international commitments followed by states, but by economic operators. So that's an important element in the report, and that's where we start from. Now, we also, at the end of the report, reflect, of course, on what are some of the implications. So in the report, we highlight the different ways in which public policy can pursue and integrate voluntary sustainability standards in integration. But that, of course, also has some implications. And at the end of the report, we try to delve into some of these implications in terms of the capacity of voluntary sustainability standards to certify on a large scale. For some, that will not be a problem. For others, that might be more problematic. Second, the point also already referred to by Santiago is the whole issue of recognizing credible from non-credible voluntary sustainability standards. That's an important aspect which needs to happen. But what we also observe in the report is that through all these different types of initiatives which are currently already occurring in sustainable public procurement, in trade policy and so on, we get a bit of a proliferation of different types of recognition systems, which in the end can create a problem of its own because you need to comply as a VSS with very different requirements. Third, we highlight the important issue which Christina already introduced in the beginning of oversupply of certified products. And many VSS don't want to certify as much as possible, but they want to transform markets. And if you create a situation through the integration of public policy that you have more certified produce than you can actually sell on the market, then you're actually defeating your own purpose to a degree. Finally, we focus on what we call distributional effects, and we really need to think about if we really use public policy to further increase the adoption of voluntary sustainability standards. We really need to make sure that, especially in the least developed countries, we don't exclude exporters from certain markets because of increasing and more stringent requirements. So that's in a nutshell what we tried to do in the report.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, thank you, Santiago and Axel, for this comprehensive overview of the main findings of the report. We start to have some questions already from the participants. I would like to, before addressing, providing the word to my colleagues, Elizabeth and Natalie, I would like to highlight a couple of things. First, what you mentioned, that sustainability considerations are increasingly incorporated in public policy, either public procurement or trade. And that opens an opportunity for VSSs to be used as a mechanism of compliance or due diligence or enforcement, given common sustainable development goals, of VSSs and public policy. And that opens an opportunity for further attack, but also it opens certain risks and questions that you have pinpointed, including the credibility of standards, including the increased proliferation of standards. And as well, it opens the issue of to what extent can be considered on a voluntary basis, on a mandatory basis. That's something that we even have a question on this in the chat that we can come up later on. So, and the report builds on specific examples from evidence that countries are using on how they are using voluntary standards in public policy to meet different sustainable development goals. So thank you, both of you, for providing this outline, and we will discuss now with the audience on this. I would like to give the word to Lisbeth, my colleague Lisbeth, who's going to comment some of these findings from her experience in sustainable public procurement at IISD. Lisbeth.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I really want to congratulate Santiago, Axel, and no doubt many colleagues for an excellent report, very thought-provoking as well, and great to see the links between these essential areas of public policy like trade and procurement actually being discussed in the area of VSS. What I would like to do in the next 5 minutes is to provide some additional reflections based on the work that we have been doing at IISD on sustainable procurement and reflections on how do we really let VSS deliver on their full potential through SPP, sustainable public procurement. As the report and in your presentation also emphasized, public procurement is that powerful pull for demand for sustainable products, services, and public works. Now, where sustainable public procurement has traditionally struggled with implementation, or at least one of the barriers has been the capacity of procurement agencies to determine what is sustainable and what is not. Procurement agencies are traditionally not equipped with the knowledge, the time, and the resources to know about sustainability, which is also a moving field. And so having to shift to incorporate all the new requirements also needs time. And we must also ensure that this doesn't become an additional, sustainability shouldn't become an additional burden for public procurers, but they must really see the opportunity of why are we actually pushing for introducing this through procurement processes. And so that is where VSS have a very important role to play. What is sustainable, what is not, but also how can we verify, how can compliance be verified? So I think the report covers that in depth with plenty of examples as well. And generally, we've also in our work seen that the legal and the policy frameworks will also permit for doing so, especially on the use of the VSS for compliance with criteria. There are actually absolutely no problems, as long as other means of verification for sustainability are, of course, accepted, and that we take into account the open competition and transparency principles, which of course is very important for public procurement. Now, what is in addition, I think, very important, and you hinted at it, I think, at the end of the presentation, is that when we start to use public policy to advance this, what's really crucial is that we don't start crowding out economic actors, in particular, I think, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs. And so I want to provide a couple of reflections on SMEs. I think especially now, during the pandemic, but also in light of economic recovery moving forward, SMEs are the motors of our economies, are incredibly crucial for job creation, especially also in developing countries, but equally in developed economies. So more than any other actors, they're really the ones who are also going to require protection to make sure they can keep going and they can keep innovating when it comes to sustainability moving forward. And so when we talk about sustainability and public procurement and we look at SMEs, there are other complementary actions that governments can take to make sure that SMEs have a good access to the procurement market. And I think some of the ideas here that are worth discussing and worth taking forward as well is to, first of all, make sure that procurement systems can deliver timely payments to SMEs. That is actually the #1 barrier for SMEs having access to procurement markets, and it's very important. But also, and I think that goes with the discussion on VSS and sustainability, there's a lot of training currently being done for public procurers, but it's equally important to keep reaching out to SMEs and to also provide trainings for suppliers on VSS, but also on the public procurement process and the opportunities that contracting with government actually offers for SMEs. Very important also to give suppliers and SMEs in particular some lead time, announcing public procurement plans, announcing that governments are starting to use VSS and sustainability standards in their procurement processes. It actually helps to prepare them for the shift that is, and for the trajectory that is on its way in any case. E-procurement systems is another one that we certainly advocate for, because it really helps to provide greater access for SMEs. And then there are all kinds of technicalities in the procurement process or procurement policies that can also help, of course, to ensure that SMEs have access. For example, set aside a dedicated percentage of procurement contracts for SMEs. So I think those complementary policies and actions in the procurement space are important to really make sure that the update of VSS through public procurement processes can help. And then lastly, what is essential for sustainable public procurement, and this goes beyond the discussion of VSS as well, is that tenders should be awarded on best value, on most economically advantageous principles, not based on lowest price. And that is really, it's a shift that has been happening in public procurement over the past years, for sure, but there is more work to be done to actually shift the mindset from buying based on lowest price to buying based on best value or on the life cycle costs of products. So not buying what's the cheapest upfront, but really looking over the lifetime of a product. And that will also be crucial, I believe, to ensuring that more and more VSS are going to be used in public procurement processes.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. I think you provided certain examples based on ISD experience on these measures that a government can establish to invite SMEs to apply to the sustainable public procurement tenders and enable competing in those and not being excluded. I think this is those questions those measures that you highlighted are very relevant to consider going forward. As well as, I would like to highlight your last point. I mean, the cheapest option is not necessarily the less costly for the society and even for the government as well. I mean, there are environmental and social aspects that need to be built in. And it's a change of paradigm that you highlighted, and the circular economy approach and the life cycle approach works in that direction on enabling that shift of paradigm of different actors, including private actors and the government itself. Thank you, Lisbeth, for those remarks. I mean, I would like to invite now my colleague Natalie to provide her comments from the trade policy angle.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christina, and thank you, everybody. I also, like Lisbeth, want to congratulate the authors on a really great report. And in any event, the entire series is very useful. And I'm also always impressed with, the initiative itself, the UNFSS, and the collaboration across the UN agencies. And there, I think, are lessons to be learned in that context as well, because I think the UN working together with the different strengths is particularly strong that way. So both the series and the whole initiative of the UNFSS, I think, are really great developments. The paper is also very useful and quite timely, because we see, for example, at the WTO, but also elsewhere, that the trade and environment discussions are really picking up again. And we're at IISD, we're following this quite closely with a lot of interest. And I just want to make a few quick points on the trade elements of this report. So Lisbeth has already spoken about public procurement, and I'd like to focus maybe just very quickly on the free trade agreement issue, which is covered very extensively and well in the report. And so we learned from the report that increasingly the free trade agreements incorporate environmental provisions, but only few, and not that many yet, are incorporating references to voluntary sustainability standards. But at the same time, we are seeing that happening nevertheless, even if it's not as frequent. And of course, there the report explains how the EU is probably the front runner here, referencing VSS in their free trade agreements. But at the same time, those provisions in the EU free trade agreements really are just, to show the support of the EU for these types of approaches and systems, but not really, bringing in disciplines or requirements that actually lead to maybe specific action of the party to the free trade agreement. And in this context, I just wanted to mention an initiative that is now underway, which quite prominently mentions VSS, and that's an initiative that was launched recently by 6 countries: New Zealand, Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, which is called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade, and Sustainability. And very interestingly, one of the 3 major focus areas is the voluntary standards. And they commit to the development of guidelines to inform the development and implementation of voluntary eco-labeling programs and associated mechanisms to encourage their promotion and application. And they feel that this will help support the development of high integrity eco-labels that are transparent in their criteria and meaningful for consumers. So we don't know exactly where this will go. We know, and the report, your report actually mentions, you know, some of the proposals to make the VSS more transparent and subject to some of the trade disciplines. So I'm not sure if they're going in that direction or if it's more to, you know, think about, for example, mutual supportiveness, and they mention guidelines to inform the development and implementation of voluntary standards. So it could also be a different approach. And so I think this will be an interesting experiment, because it will probably be the first agreement that looks at this in a little bit more detail. And as we know, when there is one agreement, then there will be, or there sometimes are, copycat agreements that follow. So it'll be interesting to watch, and also to discuss with the countries, you know, what would be a good way forward. I think that for me, the questions about free trade agreements to ask are really, the most important to me are, you know, what you also mentioned in the report, whether how these will affect developing countries, especially. And here you might ask, you know, is an agreement between two developed countries different from, should it be different in terms of VSS provisions compared to an agreement between developed and developing countries? And to some extent, both of them can have impacts on the developing country in terms of market access and leading to higher costs, because countries, if they don't want to lose access to certain markets, producers, I mean, in those developing countries have to adapt to the new, rather pricey certification systems, and might lose the access that they previously had. So I would recommend one thing for sure, that if countries do negotiate on VSS provisions, that they do an ex-ante impact assessment of the free trade agreement, because even two countries that might not, you know, the two countries that might not involve a developing countries still could have impact ultimately on the market access of those developing country producers. So I think an ex-ante impact assessment would be needed if these new types of provisions are integrated in free trade agreements. And I also, you mentioned, you know, the mutual recognition of VSS could be important. And I think that's something really to explore in the context of free trade agreements as well. And you mentioned, you know, in that case, you would look at three types of requirements. You would look at substantive, procedural, and value chain requirements. And that is definitely something to explore for countries that want to negotiate VSS in their trade agreements. And just to close, one interesting, I think, opportunity is also for regional agreements to think about the role of VSS. So for example, you know, similar countries, for example, in the Eastern African region, would it make sense for them to think about the type of mutual recognition of certain types of voluntary sustainability standards to increase their market opportunities within their region, but maybe also then outside. So I think I'll close there, but I think it's a great report. And I think, like I said, it's very timely. And I think that many countries will be looking at it when they think about what to do with VSS, also in the context of their free trade agreements.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Natalie, for commenting from the trade perspective. In the context of the free trade agreement, you mentioned something important, you know, the possibility to do an ex-ante impact assessment to be able for these countries to better manage the risk and limitations, or including labels in the free trade agreement. That's an important takeaway from your contribution. Thank you so much. Listen, we have a lot of questions in the chat. So the topic is very interesting. We have like 10, 15 minutes. So let's go now for the Q&A. I have here one from Jane. It seems that VSSs are gradually transforming into mandatory requirements for trade. Caution should be taken to deter VSSs for becoming non-tariff barriers of trade. Axel, Santiago, can you address that? This issue of being mentioned, being integrated versus being mandatory. How can you address this question, please?
I mean, the essence is really, this is the essence. Will VSS be regulatory or non-regulatory? Of course, we have the voluntary component of sustainability standards. In many ways, the fact that they're voluntary just makes them that they're not supposed to be discussed inside the WTO trade agreements. In essence, they're supposed to be sustainability standards that function in the business sector, if we want to put it like that, either consumer to consumer or business to business. So in a way, it doesn't address the questions about what is the role of governments with regards to voluntary sustainability standards. And for these reasons, because we believe that it does have an impact on the way, on the development path, we believe that governments need to have a sort of be part of the dialogue in terms of voluntary sustainability standards. Now, in many ways, we can even look at voluntary sustainability standards in the same way that ISO standards are. ISO standards can be, in a way, adopted by governments and become regulatory and then become mandatory in the way they function in the markets. But many ISO standards are not regulatory, are not voluntary. What we like to think about it from our perspective in the United Nations is this is, of course, the choice of the development choice of each country that needs to have when it looks into the policy tools that they have, in essence, for their development path. And this is something I will let Axel follow up with the argument, because I know he will do much better than me. This is the risk when voluntary sustainability standards can become a barrier to trade, in essence, and could become a barrier if in a way they become mandatory without the necessary preconditions that need to be there to avoid this issue. So I just let Axel follow up with this argument a bit more.
Thank you, Santiago. I think it's a very, very good question. And to a certain degree, of course, there are non-tariff barriers to trade because they provide, say, technical requirements for producers. But there are no way, I think, as some kind of a non-tariff barrier in a protectionist manner. They try to provide certain requirements for producers to meet on sustainability criteria. And the question then is, of course, whether these are legitimate concerns to be included in trade agreements and in trade instruments. And we see increasingly that a concern for sustainability implications of international trade are recognized and are integrated in trade agreements. And the use of voluntary sustainability standards is just one way, but there are also other ways to deal with that issue. That, of course, does not preclude that it really does have certain effects. And what we call on the report, these distributional effects are very important to think about. And then, of course, the big question is how to address them and what can we do in order to make sure that some of the economic costs related to certification are covered. And that's, for me, still an important debate to be held, and an important debate where we need to reflect on some of the elements which are important in that context. Actually, in that context, I also want to thank Lisbeth very much for some of her comments, because we look at distributional effects in the report in relation to how certain countries might be excluded from international trade through these dynamics. But you make a very important point that it also includes within countries certain producers like SMEs and others, and that's some of the things we might want to pick up a bit further, because the distributional effects do not only play out between countries, but also between economic operators within one country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you for addressing that question. We have another one that refers to the agreement that Natalie mentioned, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability that a group of 6 countries are currently negotiating, that incorporates developing a guidance for eco-labeling, what would you advise them? I mean, based on the recommendations that you put forward in your report, you know, mutual recognition, convergence, divergence, what would you advise to these countries? Axel.
That's a good question. One thing I would advise them, especially when they're really, I have to look into the details on how they want to integrate them and how they're currently thinking about it, because it's new for me. And when Natalie mentioned it, I already started Googling whether I could find it, but something to be looked into. But if it's really, let's say, in terms of commitments, then they really have to make sure that one, they make clear about what would be considered a VSS in the context of an agreement, namely this whole debate between credible and non-credible ones. And second, an important issue there is to really look at what I would call the market impact of any provisions with regard to recognize as VSS, in the sense that you need a sufficient number of VSS per commodity to make a system like that work, because you can run the risk of creating monopolies for certain voluntary sustainability standards with regard to specific commodities, and that's something you also don't want to occur. So you really need to address this issue of recognizing the credible from the non-credible ones, but once you do recognize the credible from the non-credible ones, that there are sufficient players which can play an important role in certifying commodities. Third point, I think you need to get into the details per commodity. I don't think you can have general provisions on VSS, but you can have provisions with regard to specific type of commodities, and you need, I think, to detail that further if you want to include them further in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Focus on commodity. Very good. We have another question here. The high cost of certification audited, which is the conformity assessments, can limit adoption, especially among smallholder and medium-sized operations. How can governments and international organizations help to address this to make sure that VSS's benefits are more accessible? Santiago, you want to take that one?
Well, I think this is the fundamental question that we look at when we analyze the small and medium enterprises and how producers can go into the uptake of voluntary sustainability standards. We, in terms of the United Nations, we do try to put this issue at the forefront so that we can sort of have a shared responsibility from the standard systems and other players in the sort of economic value chain. We do believe that it's a joint effort, so that we don't discriminate any type of producers from this sort of market by the issue of the cost of the auditing and things like that, and the transparency. That's what we try to do in terms of the United Nations. Of course, I think IISD has also done a bit of work in terms of the financial mechanisms that can be put in place to support this kind of barrier, which is the access to certification in a way. And I do commend the kind of work and the kind of proposals that you have done in terms of development of the financial sites that need to be put together for small and medium enterprises. And this is something that needs to be looked at with this type of recommendations with governments in the north and in the south, not only necessarily in the south.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, mechanisms to enable financing the cost of certification can come from different ways, buyers, governments, and other entities. We have another question here. Since VSSs are developed by normally private sector actors, how does one promote mutual recognition? Some standards like Global Gap have provision for benchmarking national schemes, but others, such as, for instance, FSSA in forestry, are close to those benchmarking with national schemes. Maybe I think these questions ask for an explanation of these mutual recognition agreements. Yeah.
Maybe if I can come in here, I think it's an excellent question. We looked at mutual recognition between voluntary standards quite some time ago. And what we're talking about here is that one standard recognizes another standard as equivalent. For instance, FSC would recognize PEFC as equivalent. And what we see occurring in the market of voluntary sustainability standards is that such a mutual recognition is actually very rare and not often occurring. And why is that a problem? It's a problem because sometimes producers need to have 3, 4, 5 certificates for the same commodity. If, for instance, Carrefour says to a producer, I only want to have FSC certified wood-based products, but another retailer, Walmart, would say, I want PEFC, then the same producer, if he wants to sell to the 2 retailers, need to go through the cost of getting the 2 certificates. And that problem is solved if you would have mutual recognition between voluntary sustainability standards. And what we're currently observing is that there is very little mutual recognition between voluntary sustainability standards, and in that way, little cooperation. And the reasons for that are multifold. One is that some of these standards differ between the different VSS because some focus more on environmental dimension, while others might focus more on social dimensions. The way they try to organize conformity assessment and enforcement might differ. In a nutshell, they have each their own way of working, which they might think is better than the other one, which results in very little mutual recognition. But it's a very important point. And to the specific question on how can we promote mutual recognition, I don't have an answer because you cannot force them to mutually recognize them. And the only thing I would say is that from, let's say, their perspective, they should also see the benefits of mutual recognition. And one of the benefits of mutual recognition might be that many more producers are certified. But then, of course, they need to find some common ground to get a mutual recognition agreement between voluntary sustainability standards. But it's definitely a very important point and a point of attention for the future.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, important to see the benefits of these mutual recognition schemes when it has happened. We have, the experience of Rainforest Alliance and UTS, which is like a merger. We have in the mining industry standards that have agreed to, leverage similar audit process to save cost of producers. So what are those benefits and how can this influence further mutual recognition practices between the standards? That's something that, Axel has mentioned. We have also another question here. How can a public buyer identify a credible VSS? That's a very important and difficult question, Axel, Santiago.
Maybe Lisbeth can also come in.
Yeah, Lisbeth here.
In certain ways, they are identified in the buying guides for public procurement. But in more general way, there are, let's say, there are some requirements or criteria included in sustainable public procurement legislation to which voluntary sustainability standards should comply in order to be seen as a credible one. And that, for instance, includes that they need an open and consensus-based standard setting process. That might include that they need third-party auditing and these types of things. But in that respect, actually, I think some sustainable public procurement legislation can go further and deeper and be more elaborate on what they really would recognize as a credible versus a non-credible one. But they always have to balance this issue of making sure that there is enough choice between different labels to choose from in order not to create monopolies for certain groups.
Excellent. Lisbeth, you want to add something here?
Well, I think just briefly complementing, fully agree with Axel. I think we cannot just use any VSS in public procurement. There are a lot of buying guides per jurisdiction almost that actually illustrate what are the ways to do so, and there's a range of conditions. And I think the safest way for a public buyer to go about this is to ensure that in technical specifications you include the standards and the criteria behind and you elaborate on them in the tender, and you use a VSS as a means of compliance, and leave it open for other means of verification to illustrate this product meets these requirements.
Very good. And let's close with a final one, if I may. I mean, in your perspective, what would be a feasible roadmap for governments or public entities take to create a more level playing field for VSS certified products with regards to tax policies such as VAT?
Tax policies.
Yeah. I guess this question refers to.
I mean, it's basically this differentiating between products according to their sort of either sustainability concerns that they address. In a very way, is very similar to different tariffs. Also, if you want to think about the international trade, where there's a lot of discussion about should there be the tariffs depending on the impact that they have on. Of products are traded depending on climate change and things like that. This is a huge element of discussion that I mean, both on the tax level and on the trade level. I wouldn't feel comfortable in saying that we should jump into this policy instrument in generalizing in terms of the whole things. I think we can distinguish there are certain products that might need to be looked at more in detail, like carbon emissions in terms of CO2 emissions and things like that, where we can think as the carbon tax and things like that. But other products might be a bit more sensitive if we kind of think about what other distribution or effects, like Axel likes to call it, or discriminatory effects that might happen from this. This is my reading on this question. I will let Axel address, and then afterwards I just want to add something very quickly afterwards, but maybe Axel has something that wants to comment.
No, I don't have anything to add on this, Santiago.
Okay. Yeah. No, well, it's a very, very good question that maybe we should be looking at a bit more in detail. I wanted to pick up just also before letting go and on one of the issues that Natalie brought in her presentation, which was really fantastic in terms of how VSS is being dealt in free trade agreements, in bilateral trade agreements, and then of course in the effects in terms of regional trade agreements. I think Natalie really is pointing into the direction of what is the reality, and this is what I want to say. In the report, we're not really mentioning that this should be included because, of course, of all the risks that we have in terms of the free trade agreements and how they should be done. We are pointing out as a reality of what's happening in terms of what it's being utilized by in some of those free trade agreements and how it's being utilized. It's more clear cut when it comes to export promotion tools that we want to consider VSS as something that can happen in that kind of mechanism, where we can by directing the sort of trade into a more sustainable trade. At this stage, I think it's very dangerous if we don't put if we don't have the complementary policies that need to come with regards to trade agreements and things to that, to make sure that we are not leaving out any developing countries and marginalizing any small and medium enterprises of the sort of trade opportunities that they can have if we do not decide, if we put in place this kind of voluntary sustainability policies. For this question, it's important the elements of transparency, the elements of trade facilitation, and of course, there's the element of capacity building and support for those economies or those producers that are in small and medium enterprise and producers in developing countries. I think this is something that we've been working with you also, Christina, in our projects in IISD, which is fundamental. And just to add, because Natalie mentioned that this might be a component inside regional trade agreements, and I do totally also agree with this thing, but what we're seeing in the UNFSS context, and this is something that I want to share with you, in the UNFSS context, we have countries like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa talking to each other. And the fact that we're talking about voluntary sustainability standards, we see where nations, big producers of this commodity, big buyers of these commodities, which are like China, and big producers or exporters like Brazil are talking to each other. China and India are talking to each other on how they can put in place, or in a way look at voluntary sustainability standards through their own mechanisms so that they can advance the sustainability agenda. Because let us not forget that the sustainability agenda is not a question only about the European Union or other markets in the North. If we don't have the sustainability agenda in those large emerging economies and in all those other economies, we're not going to achieve what we want. And that's why we want to have to bring on board everybody on the dialogue, from the South, from the North, from the small to the big. And that's sort of what I wanted to say, Christina.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, all the participants, for these questions. Very good questions, very thought-provoking questions. And there are some of them that might have been left to answer. We will do that in the page, in the event page in our website. The recording will be shared because, you know, I see some people asking for that. The recording will be shared, as well as the questions that have been left to answer. We will manage to answer them. We will forward with an email. So I would say that it has been a very insightful and interesting conversation. I think I pick up the word of Natalie mentioned. This report is very timely. Is very timely. So congratulate Santiago and Axel and UNFSS for this effort, because it allows to know what is happening, you know, how standards are being integrated in public policy and trade. What are the risks, what are the limits, and what needs to be worked out, you know, because the, you know, it opens up further aspects to explore. And in this context where we see countries are increasingly looking at VSSs as potential avenues to complement their role to meet sustainable development objectives. So thank you so much, everybody, for your time, for your contribution, your thoughts, your questions. I would like to end up with, you know, leverage what Santiago started at the beginning. You know, we are you pay tribute to these two leaders that started these visionary initiatives. I think we are all part of this sustainable road, and you know, we take the role that others have started, and we try to you know, expand and deepen the work towards sustainability, and looking forward to continue collaborating with UNFSS in different fronts, and to make the way clear for how you know, sustainability can be further implemented, and what is that role of VSSs in this space. So thank you so much, everybody. So I would give the word to Professor Makane to close this webinar.
Thank you very much, Christina, and of course, congratulations again to Santiago and Axel for such a great report. And it was a really fascinating presentation. I have to say that I've learned a lot on voluntary sustainability standards, and I hope that we can continue the work on this to enhance the national capacity, in particular of developing countries, and helping them in ensuring that voluntary sustainability standards help them in achieving SDGs. So thank you again so much. Many thanks also to Lisbeth and Natalie for excellent comments and very thought provocative comments. And then last but not least, many thanks to Christina for great moderation and very insightful moderation. As I said at the beginning, we couldn't dream of having a better moderator than you. And so I think I was confirmed in my affirmation. So thank you again to everybody, and in particular to our participants. I think that it was again another successful event. And of course, we are looking forward to the next session of the IISD University of Geneva webinar series on trade and sustainable development. So goodbye to everybody, and thanks again. And I know that I forgot again to thank Sophia Sophia was always in the background, but who's the one who makes sure that everything is functioning perfectly. So Sophia, thank you so much. And again, thanks to Lisbeth for putting together such another great topic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Thank you.